Here is a statistic that should stop you in your tracks. Jewish people make up roughly 0.2% of the world's population, 2 out of every 1,000 human beings on Earth. Yet, as of 2025, at least 220 of the 965 individual Nobel Prize winners in history have been Jewish. That is 22% of all laureates. In economics, the number is even more extreme. 40% of the prizes have gone to Jewish recipients. In physics, 26%. In medicine, 26%. In chemistry, 19%. In the 1970s, the peak decade, over 30% of all Nobel laureates were Jewish. To put this in perspective, if Nobel Prizes were distributed proportionally to population size, Jewish people would have won roughly 2 prizes in the entire history of the award. They have won 220. That is, 110 times their expected share. No other ethnic group on Earth shows a statistical anomaly of this magnitude in any comparable measure of intellectual achievement. It is not even close. This fact has inspired pride, suspicion, conspiracy theories, serious academic research, and uncomfortable questions that most people would rather avoid. So let us not avoid them. Why do Jewish people, and specifically Ashkenazi Jews, win so many Nobel Prizes? Is it genetics? Is it culture? Is it education? Is it persecution? The real answer involves all of these, and it is far more interesting than any simple explanation. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Before we look at explanations, we need to establish that this is not a cherry-picked statistic or a trick of counting. The overrepresentation is consistent across every field, every decade, and virtually every measure of elite intellectual achievement. Jewish scientists have won 38% of the United States National Medal of Science. Jewish mathematicians have won 27% of the Fields Medal, the highest honor in mathematics. Jewish researchers account for 35% of Israel's Wolf Foundation Prize winners and 24% of Japan's Kyoto Prize recipients. In American higher education, Jewish scholars have held a disproportionate share of faculty positions at elite universities throughout the 20th century, despite quotas that actively worked to keep their numbers down. And this is overwhelmingly an Ashkenazi phenomenon. The vast majority of Jewish Nobel laureates trace their ancestry to the Ashkenazi communities of Central and Eastern Europe. Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, who have their own rich intellectual traditions, are not represented at remotely the same rate. Whatever is driving this phenomenon, it appears to be rooted specifically in the Ashkenazi experience, the culture, the history, and possibly the genetics of the Jewish communities that developed in medieval and early modern Europe. So what explains it? The most widely cited explanation is cultural, and it begins not in a university but in a synagogue. For over 2,000 years, Jewish religious life has been organized around a practice that is fundamentally different from most other religious traditions: the study and debate of texts. The Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, is not a book of answers. It is a book of arguments. Page after page records rabbis disagreeing with each other, challenging each other's logic, proposing alternative interpretations, and refusing to accept any conclusion simply because an authority figure declared it to be true. The structure of Talmudic study is inherently dialectical. You do not learn what the text says. You learn how to argue with what the text says. This practice created something remarkable over centuries. It embedded into Jewish culture a set of cognitive habits, including rigorous analysis, skepticism toward authority, comfort with complexity and ambiguity, and above all, the belief that asking a good question is more valuable than memorizing the right answer. These habits are exactly what scientific research and intellectual innovation require. The Nobel laureate Isidore Rabi, who won the 1944 prize in physics for foundational work on quantum mechanics, captured this perfectly when he described his childhood. Every other mother in his Brooklyn neighborhood asked her children the same question after school. "Did you learn anything today?" His mother asked a different question. "Did you ask a good question today?" Robbie credited this single difference with making him a scientist. This is not a minor cultural quirk. It is a civilizational commitment to inquiry that has been practiced, reinforced, and transmitted across roughly 100 generations. In traditional Ashkenazi communities, the most respected man in the village was not the wealthiest or the strongest. It was the best scholar. Families competed to marry their daughters to the most promising Talmud students. Entire communities pooled resources to support young men who showed intellectual promise, freeing them to study full-time. Social status was earned through learning, not land or military service, a value system that was almost entirely unique in medieval Europe, where the aristocracy was defined by blood and sword. When Jewish communities valued literacy and textual analysis, at a time when the vast majority of Europeans could not read, they were building an intellectual infrastructure that would pay dividends for centuries once the doors of secular education finally opened. By one estimate, Jewish male literacy rates in medieval Europe exceeded 90%, at a time when Christian literacy was in the single digits. This was not coincidental. Jewish law required fathers to educate their sons, and the communal structures of Jewish life enforced this obligation rigorously. The result was a population that had been systematically training for abstract intellectual work for a millennium before the first modern university opened its doors to Jewish students. But culture alone does not explain the anomaly. Plenty of cultures value education and intellectual achievement. What makes the Jewish case different is the specific historical conditions under which this culture developed. For most of their history in Europe, Ashkenazi Jews were excluded from land ownership, barred from most professions, confined to specific trades, and subject to periodic expulsion and violence. The occupations available to them, moneylending, trade, medicine, and eventually law and scholarship, were precisely the occupations that rewarded literacy, numeracy, and abstract reasoning. Over centuries, this created a population that was, by economic necessity, selected for cognitive skills. If you could not own land, your survival depended on your ability to think, calculate, negotiate, and adapt. This is what sociologists call occupational selection, and its effects compound over generations. When the primary path to economic survival requires intellectual ability, and when those who fail economically are more likely to leave the community through conversion, assimilation, or poverty, the population that remains is progressively shaped by the very pressures that were meant to marginalize it. The irony is devastating. The restrictions designed to weaken Jewish communities may have inadvertently strengthened the cognitive profile of the population that endured them. The sociologist Nathan Glazer argued that 2,000 years of existence as a diaspora minority, always othered, always potentially at risk, created habits of foresight, discipline, and emphasis on portable skills that no settled majority population would ever need to develop to the same degree. You cannot take land with you when you are expelled. But you can take knowledge. And that lesson, learned and relearned across centuries of displacement, became embedded in Ashkenazi culture at a level so deep it barely needs to be articulated. It is simply understood. Education is survival. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable and where intellectual honesty requires us to engage with an idea that many people would prefer to dismiss. In 2005, a team of researchers at the University of Utah published a paper called Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence. The authors, Gregory Cochran, Jason Hardy, and Henry Harpending proposed that the high average IQ scores measured in Ashkenazi populations, typically estimated at 107 to 115 depending on the study and the measure used, are not purely the result of culture, but may have a genetic component shaped by natural selection during the medieval period. Their argument goes like this. Between roughly 800 CE and 1700 CE, Ashkenazi Jews in Europe were confined to a narrow set of cognitively demanding occupations, primarily finance, trade, and estate management. Success in these occupations correlated with higher income. Higher income correlated with more surviving children. And because the Jewish community was largely endogamous, which means people married within the group, any genetic variance that enhanced cognitive ability would have been amplified across generations through this selection pressure. The same genetic bottleneck that produced elevated rates of diseases like Tay-Sachs and Gaucher disease in the Ashkenazi population, the authors argued, may also have produced elevated cognitive ability through the same mechanisms of genetic drift and selection in a small, isolated population. This hypothesis remains deeply controversial. Many geneticists and social scientists have criticized the paper's methodology, its assumptions, and its conclusions. The relationship between specific genes and complex traits like intelligence is not well understood, and the leap from medieval occupational patterns to measurable genetic effects on IQ involves assumptions that have not been proven. Others have pointed out that high IQ populations like East Asians do not show the same overrepresentation in Nobel Prizes, suggesting that IQ alone, even if the Ashkenazi average is genuinely elevated, cannot be the full explanation. The honest position is this: the genetic hypothesis has not been proven, and it has also not been refuted. It remains one component of a much larger picture that includes culture, history, persecution, and opportunity. Perhaps the most overlooked factor in the Jewish Nobel Prize phenomenon is timing. For most of their history in Europe, Jews were legally excluded from universities, professional guilds, and public life. The Enlightenment and the gradual emancipation of European Jews in the 18th and 19th centuries opened doors that had been sealed for over 1,000 years. When those doors opened, the effect was explosive. Within a single generation of gaining access to secular universities, Jewish students began achieving at extraordinary rates. By the late 19th century, Jewish researchers were already making disproportionate contributions to physics, chemistry, mathematics, and medicine in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and France. Albert Einstein published his 4 revolutionary papers in 1905, barely a generation after full emancipation in the German-speaking world. In Hungary, Jewish students made up roughly a quarter of university enrollment by the early 20th century, despite constituting only 5% of the population. In Vienna, Jewish physicians dominated the medical faculties. In Berlin, Jewish physicists and chemists were central to the revolution in modern science. The pattern was unmistakable and unprecedented. What happened was not that Jewish people suddenly became intelligent. It was that a population with centuries of accumulated intellectual culture, a deeply ingrained ethic of learning and inquiry, and cognitive habits shaped by Talmudic study, was suddenly given access to the institutions and tools of modern science. The result was like removing a dam from a river. The water had been building for 1,000 years. When the barrier came down, the flood was inevitable. And then the Holocaust destroyed the very communities that had produced this explosion of achievement. 6 million Jews were murdered, including an incalculable number of scientists, scholars, and potential Nobel laureates. The intellectual centers of Ashkenazi life in Warsaw, Vilna, Budapest, Vienna, and Berlin were annihilated. The fact that Jewish Nobel Prize achievement continued after the Holocaust, driven largely by emigrant scientists who had fled to the United States, Britain, and Israel, speaks to the resilience of a culture that valued knowledge above almost everything else. There is one more piece of this story that complicates the narrative of permanent Jewish intellectual dominance. The percentage of Jewish scientists among new American PhDs has been declining for decades. As Jewish communities in the United States have become more assimilated, more economically comfortable, and less defined by the pressures that historically drove intellectual achievement, the pipeline of young Jewish scientists entering the academy has narrowed. Some scholars have predicted that Jewish overrepresentation among Nobel Prize winners will gradually diminish over the coming decades as the generation shaped by the immigrant experience and the post-Holocaust drive to rebuild gives way to a more integrated, less distinctively driven population. Meanwhile, populations from East Asia, South Asia, and other regions are rapidly increasing their representation in elite science, driven by the same forces that propelled Jewish achievement: cultural emphasis on education, immigrant ambition, and expanding access to world-class institutions. If these scholars are right, the era of Jewish Nobel dominance may turn out to have been a specific historical phenomenon, a product of a unique confluence of culture, genetics, persecution, opportunity, and timing, rather than a permanent feature of the Jewish population. That does not diminish what has been accomplished. It makes it more remarkable. A population that was confined, persecuted, expelled, and nearly exterminated produced a body of scientific and intellectual work that reshaped the modern world, not because they were genetically superior, not because of some mystical quality, but because a culture that valued asking questions over accepting answers, that treated learning as both sacred duty and survival strategy, and that had been sharpened by 1,000 years of exclusion, was finally given the freedom to show what it could do. And what it did was extraordinary. It split the atom. It developed the polio vaccine. It created the theory of relativity. It founded psychoanalysis. It revolutionized economics. It decoded the human genome. It changed the world. And it did it in numbers that no statistical model can account for by chance alone. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Thank you for watching. If you want to go deeper, the next video on your screen is one you will not want to miss. I'll see you there. Sources and links. List of Jewish Nobel laureates. Wikipedia. un.wikipedia.org. /wiki/list of Jewish Nobel laureates. Jewish Nobel Prize winners. jinfo. www.jinfo.org/nobelprizes.html. Cochran G., Hardy J., and Harpending H. Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence. Journal of Biosocial Science, 2006. Murray C., Jewish Genius, Commentary, 2007. Glazer N. and Moynihan D.P. Beyond the Melting Pot, MIT Press, 1963. Kaplan N. Why Jews Win So Many Nobel Prizes. Future of Jewish, 2024. Available at futureofjewish.com/p/y-jews-win-so-many-Nobel-prizes. Why do Jews win so many Nobel Prizes? The Jewish Independent Australia, 2025. Available at thejewishindependent.com.au/Jewish-Nobel-Prize-Overrepresentation.